Niche non-fiction. This is something I absolutely adore, when a non-fiction book does a deep dive on something very specific that might seem incredibly niche, which might even seem like it has quite a limited audience, but in fact can actually either expand your knowledge on something, introduce you to a new topic, or connect something seemingly small to the wider world around you. And for that reason, I thought I would sit down and talk about some of my favourite niche non-fiction books. So when I say niche non-fiction book, in order to provide you with a little bit more clarification, what I mean by that is that a book on women in antiquity would not be niche. However, if the book was specifically about the lives of the Vestal Virgins in ancient Rome, then that I would perhaps consider more niche. I wouldn't consider a book on 21st century cinema necessarily that niche, but I might consider a book on the representation of sapphic love in 21st century media a little bit more in the niche side. And even within that, there's definitely a range of books in this video, from like the super micro niche of like one specific TV show to slightly more broad historical periods but looking at it through a specific lens, for example. So whether you're looking to get into non-fiction or to just learn about something you don't know much about already, or maybe expand on something you do know about but from a specific angle, then hopefully this video is of interest to you. And without further ado, let's crack on with the recommendations. Alright, so my first recommendation is an absolute like favourite of mine. I read this one back in maybe 2019 or so. Yeah, it came out in 2019, so I might have actually read it in 2018 since this is a proof, and that is Not All Dead White Men by Donna Zuckerberg. And this is a book I have come back to. I've reread portions of, I've even referenced in my own work. I think it's absolutely fascinating, niche, but also contributing to a broader understanding of two topics, and that is both classical reception in the modern world and misogyny amongst the alt-right. So the subtitle of this book is Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age, and what this book is looking at is very specifically the use of and reference to and manipulation of classical mythology, whether that be Greek or Roman, by the alt-right online, on forums, on blog posts, even in news sources, on social media websites, and how they use those myths and that history, really, there's an overlap there, to justify their misogyny, their sexism, their patriarchal viewpoints, and their oppression of women. And this is actually a phenomenon that goes beyond misogyny amongst the alt-right or on online spaces amongst like incel groups, etc. But that's what this is doing a deep dive on, and although that sounds very niche, I think it very much taps into lots of different areas of interest, and also just the broader sort of way in which history and mythology can be manipulated, misused, whether those myths themselves do have misogyny and patriarchal values within them, or they are just being manipulated to look that way. Both are obviously incredibly problematic, and it's such a fascinating book, if difficult to read, both as a woman and as a classicist. I think this is actually something that, if you're interested in antiquity and mythology, if you read about, talk about, view those things online and engage with those things, this is really important sort of like background to have, I think, but also just as a feminist. So I thought this was really powerful, really interesting, and actually incredibly accessible even if you're not an expert in antiquity to begin with. So this is absolutely brilliant. But in order to keep things a little bit varied, my next recommendation is Night Terror by Alice Vernon, Troubled Sleep and the Stories We Tell About It. So this book is actually interesting because it takes a few different approaches. There's a historical approach, there is a literary criticism approach, and there's a personal approach. So Alice Vernon herself experiences or has experienced night terrors as well as other like sleep disorders, sleepwalking, etc. And she has a personal relationship with that, naturally. But she's also a scholar who explores that in literature and history. So if we're looking at, say, like Victorian literature or earlier, where it's used to either explore the inner workings of somebody's mind, or in mythology and folklore where it's attributed to possession by the devil and relates to religion historically, if that makes sense. So while being a niche book, it actually engages in quite a few different aspects of our sort of life as humans, our human existence. And I think it's really interesting, even if you're not somebody who experiences night terrors. Night terrors, as I learned from this book, being something quite distinct from nightmares. It's much more visceral, shall we say. And I found that this book tapped into a few different niche interests of mine, which was really nice. I like when it sort of takes a few different things and ties them together through this seemingly niche lens. So I really, really enjoyed that. If you're somebody who's into Gothic literature or the classics, if you're somebody who is interested in medical history, who even experiences sleep disorders themselves, and I think this book has actually quite a wide range of appeal to different readers, and I like I said, the way it ties all those things together. It's also a book I have come back to. It's a book that I have thought a lot about since reading, and I just went to see Nosferatu in the cinema like everybody else, and when I came out of the cinema, the first thing I started thinking about was this book, because of the way sort of visions and dreams and sleep and magic sort of interlinks in that film. So yeah, this is one that I really enjoyed and have, like I said, continued to interact with and think about. If you're looking for something primarily historical, however, my next recommendation is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. And not only is this a book on a very specific historical topic, but it takes a very fresh approach to that historical topic. So if you haven't heard of this book before, it is and it isn't about Jack the Ripper. What this book is about is the women who Jack the Ripper, as he is known, murdered. And it is not about Jack the Ripper, which I actually think is really important to emphasise, and what makes the book so unique and so enjoyable to learn from. I mean, it's obviously quite harrowing in moments, but you know, it's a very edifying book, shall we say. So this is a book which takes the lives of all of those women, all five of those women, and tries to trace and tie together what we know of them prior to their murder. So we are looking at the lives of five distinct, unique individuals who lived in the Victorian era, who spent at least part of their life living in London, and what that life looked like, from marriages to love affairs, their trades, their children, the way society treated them. And all of these women, to some extent or another, experienced some sort of hardship, and no longer are they simply Jack the Ripper's victims. They are individuals who had stories, who had lives, of which this terrible ending was just a small part, the ending part, the part that more often gets talked about, but there's actually a lot more to them. More interesting in many ways than this anonymous man Jack the Ripper is. And I also think it's an excellent reminder that we're sort of feeding in to the intent and ego of the men who do terrible things like Jack the Ripper did, by focusing on what he did to those women and ignoring every other part of their life. And I think this book makes you think about history differently. It teaches you about some individuals' lives, while also teaching you about a broader period in history, and it does a lot whilst being focused in on this niche subject, so I really, really loved it. Now, it wouldn't be me, of course, if there weren't a few books dealing with antiquity in this video, but of course antiquity is a period which spans millennia and covers many different civilizations and parts of the world and peoples and centuries, etc. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of niche topics to explore, but one book that I think is both interesting and accessible is Gods and Robots, Myths, Machines and Ancient Dreams of Technology by Adrian Mayer. And if this title wasn't self-explanatory enough, what this book is doing is looking for sort of traces of and concepts of automatons in mythology and history from antiquity. So looking at sort of ideas, even if they weren't realised, about like robotic sort of mechanical creatures that come to life, really demonstrating some of the foundational history in obviously a subject that feels a lot more modern, the concept of robots, but one that, you know, maybe was a part of, if not consciously, the human imagination for much, much longer. And it's a really interesting book because it brings together myths you maybe never connected before, parts of ancient history you maybe never connected before about technology through this lens. And I also think it reminds us of some of the incredible innovations that came out of antiquity. And if you're somebody who's really into modern technology and the history of the tech side of things, this might not be a book you've come across yet, but you probably would really, really enjoy. And like I said, I also think it's very accessibly written, so I think most people could just pick this up, read it and enjoy it. So my next recommendation is actually a little bit different because it's not necessarily a book per se, it's actually a magazine series, but it really just felt as though this magazine series would fit perfectly into the theme of this video, and that is hellebore. So over the past few years I've discovered a few zines, magazines and smaller journals that I've become very interested in, but hellebore has been the one that I've most consistently been interested in and read the most issues of, so I'm going to focus on that, although the other ones are quite niche too. So if you'd like some more niche magazine and journal recommendations in this kind of category, just let me know in the comments. And it's also past its 10th issue. I think we might be on issue 12 at this point, and I have them all. There's a couple I haven't read, but I've read most of them. So broadly speaking, this journal slash magazine focuses on folk horror and the occult, with a, again, focus on Britain and Ireland. There's articles on archaeology, the material world, history, texts, literature, mythology, folklore, and occasionally a few other bits of media woven in there as well, but all of which have that sort of loose theme of British and Irish folk horror and the occult. And just to give you an idea of what that might look like, I've picked up literally 3 issues at random off my shelves to show you. So this one is number 7, the ritual issue, and some of the articles in this one include Folklore for All, Killing the May Queen, Ancient Antlers Clashing Swords, and Mayday on Summer Isle. I then have number 10, the Darkness issue, which includes articles such as In Search of the English Vampire, Creatures of Darkness, and The Pale Procession. And lastly, just for this selection, we have number 6, the Summoning issue, which includes articles such as Hell is Other Readers, The Devil's Prayer Book, Spinster Satanism, which specifically was an article about a book called Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, which I then read after reading this article, became obsessed with, and have put in every single video since. So you can see how much of an influence this has had on me, as well as The House of the Great Beast. And not only are these magazines incredibly well compiled and edited, they always have the most interesting contributors, historians, authors, archaeologists, literary critics, etc., who tap into subjects I may never have heard of before, or tie in and give me new perspectives on things that I did already have ideas and thoughts about. And I've just loved every single issue that I have read of this magazine, and despite being seemingly quite niche, it covers such a broad spectrum of things within that, like, very, you know, small window. Do you know what I feel like the best metaphor is? It's like a tiny window of this folk horror and occult, particularly in Britain and Ireland, but once you like squeeze through that tiny little like church window, you then become you then find yourself in this massive, huge, expansive cathedral, because it can actually lead to so many different things. And I do believe you can buy most of their back volumes, or at least some of their back issues, on their website, as well as keep an eye out for future issues. So yeah, love hellebore. Alright, we then have a book that I read quite a few years ago, but you can tell that I enjoyed it slash got a lot from it because there's all these tabs in it. I have to say I haven't tabbed a book in a while, but this was during my tabbing on my non-fiction period. I think I tagged the blue articles that were my favourites, or that I found the most insightful, and then individual lines. I'm kind of curious now what those said, but first I'll tell you what the book is called, and that is The Geek Feminist Revolution by Cameron Hurley. This is a collection of essays all by the author, who you may know as a fiction writer or as a non-fiction writer or as both. She's done a lot in both spaces, but this has to be one of my favourite books by her because it really taps into a very specific experience I think a lot of you watching now will be able to relate to if you are a woman, because you likely occupy some sort of nerd space. I'm sorry, I'm assuming if you're watching niche book recommendations, you've got some nerdy interests. Maybe not, but I think enough of you do that this will be relevant. And if you have existed in those spaces for long enough, you have probably encountered some of the ingrained sexism and misogyny that do exist within those spaces, whether they be video game related, book related, TV and film, superhero, cosplay, what have you. There is an unfortunate amount of that, just like in the rest of the world. But when these spaces are very much lauded as being safe, inclusive, joyful places where we can explore and discuss our passions, and then you're met with this rampant misogyny, it can really be quite soul destroying, particularly when you're either a younger woman or you're first getting into these spaces. And that is obviously not to say there are not incredibly supportive and welcoming spaces within fandom, but I do think it's really important not to ignore that element and that aspect that exists there. And what Cameron Hurley does in all of these essays is explore specific incidents and specific threads of that in different spaces. So I think particularly there was a focus on like gaming, convention and literature culture, but I think some of the takeaways can certainly be applied beyond that. And like I said, I did tab through quite a few articles, so I'm curious what those were. Apparently I thought that the essay "I'll Make the Pancakes" on opting in and out of the writing game, which probably I might want to reread now that I'm a published author, because I wasn't back when I first read this. Die Hard, Hetira and the Problematic Pin-Ups, a rant. Wives, Warlords and Refugees, the People Economy of Mad Max. Obviously some of them look at very, very, very specific pieces of media, while some of them are a bit broader, or cover certain scandals that have happened in nerd spaces. A Complexity of Desires, Expectations of Sex and Sexuality in Science Fiction. This is genuinely making me want to reread this essay collection, because it's been quite a few years. It's about ethics in dating. Dear SFWA writers, let's chat about censorship and bullying. Honestly, fantastic. Could not recommend it more highly, regardless of what your gender identity is or how immersed you are in these spaces. I think you would take something away from it. The next book, which also is reasonably well tabbed, is The Honour Code by Kwame Anthony Appiah, How Moral Revolutions Happen, which may seem a little broad, may not seem the most niche, although it's still a niche, right? But what I find interesting about this book is that it examines the way in which social norms, honour codes, acceptable modes of behaviour, standard practices in societies historically have changed, how they can be changed, how, like, what is quite a big part of a culture, what is considered honourable or dishonourable, can be switched. But the author demonstrates this through 3 unique examples. So what this book effectively is, from a reader's perspective, is 3 very specific changes to society's honour codes in different times and different places. Did I say 3 subjects? I meant 4. And those 4 subjects, or those 4 honour codes / historical periods that are covered, are foot binding in 19th century China, aristocratic dueling culture in England, the topic of Atlantic slavery, but specifically looking at how ordinary people's perception and reception of that started to change and how that had an impact higher up. And then he looks at a more contemporary issue, specifically of honour killings in Pakistan of women. We then have Inside This Place, Not of It, Narratives from Women's Prisons, which has various contributors, all from the perspective of women who have been or are currently incarcerated. Now, I have to say, when I was thinking about books for this video, I wasn't sure that prisons or prison abolition was niche enough, but then again, where's the line? I guess that's still relatively a niche, but then in other regards it feels quite broad. So this book is one in that subcategory that I think is incredibly powerful, but which has the specific, niche or the specific perspective of looking at women's prisons. And I also think the structure of it makes it a little bit more niche. I don't want niche though to come across in any sense at all in this video as being of limited interest. I do not think this book is of limited interest or limited relevance. I think it's just taking the approach of being very specific. So niche, as much as anything, means specific. And what I mean about structure is that this is essentially an oral history. Obviously it's written down, unless there's an audiobook as well, I'm not sure about that. But these are all recorded interviews or stories from the women who were incarcerated or are incarcerated. So it is very, very lightly edited, but it is essentially just those women's stories that they have spoken out loud and shared with the compilers of this book. And it's a variety of different women with different experiences, but all of whom are linked by the injustices really of the incarceration system. And if you're interested in specifically prison abolition, or if you're just more generally interested in feminist non-fiction and the experiences of different women in society, then I think this is very, very important reading. And then last but not least, I could not film this video without including a very specific little series of books, and I'm sure if you've seen me talk about non-fiction in the past, you're probably waiting for these books to come up because I absolutely adore them and they are the definition of niche. So this is the 404 Inkling series, and what this little short series of non-fiction books specifically does is examine niche topics. Like, that is their niche, is to explore niche topics, and it is so much fun. What I love about these books, before I go into a few specific titles, is they sometimes remind me there are others who have that level of interest in something I'm super interested in. So if you're into like fandom culture or love like getting into the deep nitty gritty online with others who are into things you're into, then this is what reading these books is like. It also makes new topics really accessible because all of the books are written very accessibly and they're all very short. So if you don't know anything about the topic you're about to read about, then that doesn't really matter because you will be able to access the material and learn from it, and it'll make you think and it'll maybe introduce you to something else. So I just love them for that reason, and all of the authors have done phenomenal jobs. I've read more than half of the books out so far. I have most of them on my bookshelves, but these are a few that I find particularly niche that I thought I'd quickly mention to you, including the first one I ever read that introduced me to the series and made me obsessed, which is Love That Journey for Me, The Queer Revolution of Schitt's Creek. This is a must-read for anyone who likes the TV show Schitt's Creek, which is one of the best TV shows of the 21st century. I will not be taking questions at this time. I absolutely adore it. If you like that show, you need to read this book. But even if you're just more generally interested in depictions of like supportive, queer, positive dynamics in media, then you'll probably still get something from this book. It is so wonderful. We then have Electric Dreams on Sex Robots and the Failed Promises of Capitalism by Heather Parry, which is in effect about sex robots, but more than anything about how really not imminent sex robots are, and actually what our obsession with sex robots in the media, in our discussions of what's next for technology, in our discussions around women and women's body, is incredibly problematic. And it's sort of bringing what feels like a science fiction topic back down to earth and looking at the very real implications and ramifications of the interest in this subject, because what Heather Parry argues is that it's not something that's about to happen, but our obsession with it is still important to discuss. We then have They Came to Slay, The Queer Culture of D&D by Tom James Carter, and this book is the perfect antidote, shall we say, to the topics explored in Geek Feminist Revolution. If you want an example of how a fandom can be incredibly inclusive, incredibly supportive, create a safe, wonderful space full of passion and joy and solidarity, then this is the book for you, because this book shows the ways in which the queer community have embraced D&D and also what D&D can offer the queer community. And then lastly, I do have to mention that I myself have written a book in this series, which is All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths, which is essentially all about the popularity and significance of queer retellings and reimaginings of Greek mythology in the 21st century. Although also, I say 21st century, that's not entirely true. It does explore some examples from the 20th century, but particularly how that subgenre has grown, what it means to the queer community, and again how it creates this safe space to explore identity, sexuality, and our find connection to others in our community. So yeah, if you're interested in that one also exists. But overall, I just think the Inkling series is phenomenal, regardless of which one you decide to pick up. There's so many more. There's one on grief in Studio Ghibli. There's one on Doctor Who. There is one on foot fetishes. There are so many on so many different niche topics. So essentially, check out the series in general if you're interested in niche non-fiction. But those are all the books I wanted to talk about in this video. I would be particularly interested, though, in your recommendations of niche non-fiction books. I love discovering new topics via the avenue of accessible niche non-fiction, so please do share out your recommendations of literally anything. That's the point of this video, and let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.